Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The sound of a $2,000 crystal tumbler shattering against the imported marble floor was the only warning I got before the King of New York fell to his knees. There was no build-up, no slow decline into illness, just the sharp, violent crack of glass and the sudden, sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. One moment, Julian Vane was standing by the panoramic window of his penthouse office, outlining the hostile takeover of a rival tech firm with the cold, surgical precision that made him the most feared alpha in the city. The next, he was clawing at his throat, his immaculate Windsor not wrenched sideways, gasping as if the oxygen in the room had turned to ash. I didn't think, I moved. I vaulted over the mahogany desk that usually served as the impenetrable fortress between us, my knees sliding on the polished floor as I caught him just before his forehead struck the shards of glass. "Director!" I shouted, my hands gripping his shoulders. They were burning. Through the layers of his bespoke Italian suit, the heat radiating from him was nuclear. Julian Vane, the man who supposedly had ice water in his veins, was boiling alive. He looked up at me, his eyes, usually a piercing, glacial blue, now blown wide, the pupils swallowing the irises. They weren't the eyes of a predator anymore. They were the eyes of a drowning man. "Silas," he choked out, his voice a ruined gravel that sent a shiver down my spine. He gripped my wrist, his nails digging in hard enough to bruise. "Get out. Lock the door. Leave me." It was a command. It was always a command with him. But for the first time in the 3 years I had served as his executive secretary, I disobeyed. To understand the gravity of that moment, you have to understand Julian Vane. He wasn't just a boss. He was an institution. He was a prime alpha, a genetic anomaly of perfection who stood 6'3" and moved through the corporate world like a shark through bloody water. He didn't tolerate incompetence, he didn't understand fatigue, and he certainly didn't feel need. In the ecosystem of the city, he was the apex. I was a beta, or so my employment files said, competent, invisible, and safe. I was the only one he tolerated in his personal space because I didn't smell like a threat, and I didn't smell like a temptation. But as the storm clouds bruised the skyline outside the Vane Tower, sealing us inside a steel and glass cage, the biological reality of the situation began to warp. I said get out, Julian snarled, shoving me away. The force was weak, uncoordinated. He collapsed back against the leg of his desk, panting. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "I can't do that, sir," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in my chest. "Building security has initiated a weather lockdown. The elevators are grounded. We're stuck." Julian let out a low, guttural sound that was half growl, half whimper. He tore at his shirt, buttons popping and scattering across the floor like pearls. The scent hit me then. Usually, Julian masked his pheromones with expensive suppressants, leaving him smelling of nothing but crisp linen and expensive cologne. But now, the mask was gone. The air filled with the scent of cedarwood and ozone, sharp, electric, and overwhelming. But beneath the dominance of the alpha scent, there was something else. Something cloying and sweet. Burnt sugar and distress. "My suppressant," Julian gasped, squeezing his eyes shut. "The experimental batch. Dr. Eris said there might be. Side effects." "Side effects?" I asked, reaching for the water pitcher on the sidebar, my hands trembling slightly. "Director, you're burning up. Is this a rut?" "No," he hissed, his head lolling back against the wood. "It's worse. It's an inversion. It breaks the resistance. It turns the aggression inward." He looked at me then, and the raw hunger in his expression made my breath hitch. This wasn't the look of a man who wanted to conquer. It was the look of a man who wanted to be consumed. "Silas," he whispered, the name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "It hurts." I knelt beside him, offering the glass of water. He ignored it. Instead, his hand shot out, grabbing the back of my neck, pulling me down until our faces were inches apart. The heat coming off him was intoxicating, a physical weight. "Help me," he breathed. The logical part of my brain screamed that this was a bad idea. This was my employer. This was Julian Vane. If I crossed this line, I would be fired, sued, or worse. But the part of me that had watched him for 3 years, the part of me that had memorized the way his brow furrowed when he was reading contracts, the part of me that had secretly admired the lonely king on his throne, that part took over. "Tell me what you need, Julian," I said softly, dropping the honorifics. He shuddered at the sound of his name. "Control," he mumbled, his eyes losing focus. Take it." It was a paradox. The man who controlled billions of dollars, who moved markets with a whisper, was begging to surrender. The experimental drug hadn't just triggered a biological reaction. It had shattered his psychological armor. It had induced a state indistinguishable from an omega's heat, a desperate, biological imperative to be held, to be grounded, to be taken. I set the water glass down. "Okay," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Okay." I moved closer, straddling his legs. He didn't push me away. Instead, he wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in my stomach, inhaling deeply. He was trembling so violently that his teeth chattered. "Cold," he murmured. "So cold." I began to unbutton my own vest, tossing it aside. "I've got you." The dynamic in the room shifted. The skyscraper, the storm, the billions of dollars, it all faded. It was just two men in the dark. I ran my fingers through his damp, silver-blonde hair, pulling his head back to expose his throat. He whined, a high, needy sound that would have destroyed his reputation if it ever left this room. "You're usually so loud," I whispered, tracing the pulse point on his neck. "Barking orders. Making demands. Are you going to be quiet for me now, Julian?" His eyes fluttered open, hazy and dark. "Make me," he challenged, though the words lacked his usual bite. They were a plea. I didn't need to be told twice. The hours that followed were a blur of sensory overload. I had expected violence. Ruts were notoriously aggressive. But this was different. Julian wasn't trying to dominate me. He was clinging to me like I was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He was touch-starved, desperate for skin-on-skin contact. Every time I tried to pull away to give him air, he would grab at me, his fingers digging into my back, pulling me down into the friction. He was heavy, muscular, and powerful, yet he moved with a fluidity that was entirely submissive. He let me guide him. He let me pin his wrists to the floor. He let me dictate the pace. It was as if he had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for so long that the moment someone else offered to carry it, he collapsed into the relief of it. "Silas," he gasped, his back arching off the carpet as I kissed the sensitive skin beneath his jaw. "More? Please." "Please what?" I teased, testing the boundaries of this new reality. "Please. Don't stop. Don't leave." The confession hung in the air, heavier than the scent of ozone. It wasn't just the heat talking. I knew Julian. I knew his schedule. I knew he spent his nights alone in this tower, staring at the city lights, surrounded by wealth but bereft of warmth. He was a man who had sacrificed his humanity for power, and now, his biology was violently reclaiming that debt. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, and I kissed him, hard. He tasted like expensive scotch and desperation. He kissed back with a clumsy, frantic energy, his tongue tangling with mine, his hips bucking instinctively against me. We were a tangle of limbs and discarded clothing, rolling amidst the shattered glass and spilled contracts. At one point, the storm outside intensified, thunder rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian flinched, burying his face in the crook of my neck. "It's just thunder," I soothed, stroking his broad back. "I'm right here." "I hate the noise," he mumbled into my skin. "It's always so loud. Everyone is always so loud." "I know. Make it stop, Silas." "I am," I whispered. "Just focus on me. Just me." And he did. For the first time in his life, Julian Vane let go of the wheel. He let himself be vulnerable. He let a subordinate see him weak, messy, and needy. And in that surrender, I found a version of him that was infinitely more compelling than the untouchable CEO. I found the man beneath the crown. The climax, when it came, was shattering. It wasn't the triumphant roar of an alpha. It was a broken cry of release, a sobbing gasp as his body finally gave up the fight against the fever. He slumped against me, completely spent, his breathing ragged, his heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. I held him there on the floor of his office as the storm raged on. I pulled his suit jacket over us like a blanket, shielding him from the chill of the air conditioning. He didn't move. He just lay there, heavy and warm, his face pressed into my chest, his hand loosely gripping my shirt. "Silas," he whispered after a long silence. The fever was breaking. The madness was receding. "I'm here, Julian." Did I? He hesitated, his voice thick with sleep and returning shame. Did I ruin everything? I looked down at him. His hair was a mess, his lips were swollen, and the marks of my hands were visible on his shoulders. He looked destroyed. He looked beautiful. "No," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his eyes. "You didn't ruin anything. You just finally let go." He was silent for a long time. Then, slowly, he tightened his grip on my shirt. "Don't let me go back," he whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "Tomorrow, when the sun comes up, don't let me go back to being that." It was the most dangerous contract he had ever proposed. He was asking me to dismantle the king. He was asking me to keep him human. "I won't," I promised. "But the fee for that service is high, Director." He let out a short, tired huff of laughter against my ribs. "I can afford it." The sun broke over the horizon 6 hours later, painting the office in brutal, unforgiving light. The shattered glass still glittered on the floor. The ruined clothes were a testament to the night's frenzy. I was awake before him, sitting up against the desk, watching him sleep. When Julian stirred, I expected the panic. I expected the immediate recoil, the cold mask slamming back into place, the offer of a non-disclosure agreement, and a payout. He sat up, wincing as his muscles protested. He looked around the room, the memories clearly flooding back. His gaze landed on me. He froze. I didn't look away. I didn't scramble to apologize. I just waited. Julian Vane took a deep breath. He ran a hand through his hair, composing himself. Then, he looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that were clear, blue, and terrifyingly intelligent. But the ice was gone. "Silas," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "Director?" He slowly got to his feet, ignoring his nudity, standing with a dignity that had nothing to do with suits or titles. He walked over to where I sat, reaching down a hand. "Julian," he corrected. "When we are alone." "It's Julian." I stared at his hand. It was a peace offering. It was a surrender. It was a partnership. I took it. He pulled me up, but he didn't let go. He pulled me into him, his forehead resting against mine. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had dissolved. We weren't boss and employee anymore. We were something new. Something forged in the heat of a fever and sealed in the silence of a storm. "Cancel my morning meetings," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip. "And order breakfast. We have terms to negotiate." I smirked, leaning into his touch. "Yes, Julian." And that is how the viper tamed the wolf. If you enjoyed seeing the mighty Julian Vane completely undone by his own desire, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments, would you risk your career to cross the line with a boss who needed you this badly? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then.